Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I am very happy today because we are joined by a really lovely guest, and he is a dear friend of mine. He is a dear friend of ours. This is none other than the great, the one, the only, Mr. Solitary Ronin. Solitary Ronin, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me on your channel. It's an honor to be here.
No, the honor and pleasure and privilege is all mine, my friend. I've been wanting to do this for some time, but unfortunately the schedules didn't work out until today. So
You're
I'm
a busy
very,
man. So
no.
it's organized, but we're here.
It's not at all, my friend, not at all. I'm so glad we could do this because I've been meaning to do this for a long time. And so thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. I mean, as you know, you're one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, that I started my channel about 2.5 years ago. And certainly this YouTube community, you're almost like King Charlemagne. There's so many channels that are, influenced by your channel or started because of your channel. So
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm
yeah, I
very
mean,
flattered by that. Yeah.
I have kind of been an inspiration for a lot of people that have started channels, and um,
Oh, wow. So thank you. I'm
to like,
very honored. Thank you so much. And wow, I don't quite know what to say. So um thank you so much. That really means a lot, especially coming from you, because we've known each other for a long time now, at least within this YouTube space or online.
yeah, it'll be coming up for about 3 years, won't it?
Yeah, I think so. So you've been one of the people that I've known the longest, I think, since I started being online, as it
Yeah.
were. And so, and I remember our early conversations from a couple years back very fondly. And so now I'm so glad we have the opportunity, or you've given me this great opportunity to talk with you again like this live. So thank you so
Yeah, it's
much, my
kind of,
dear friend.
it's been interesting seeing how both of us have kind of changed and our channels have kind of changed over the years. It's interesting to look back.
It
Because I'm sure
is.
you look at your early videos and kind of think, who is that person? It's like,
Yeah, a little bit, yeah, it's quite different, a little bit thinner, perhaps, I don't know, but a lot thinner, I don't know. But anyway, yeah, so yeah, the channels, those are really interesting. But that's a good thing because I'd like to ask you from at the very outset about Solitary Ronin, maybe the YouTube channel, but also there are other like podcasts and things that are available also on YouTube and elsewhere. So maybe just for everyone who might be meeting you for the first time, Solitary Ronin. So could you tell us a little bit about your YouTube channel?
it's called Solitary Ronin Films. I started it, like I said, you were part of the inspiration for just going ahead and doing it. Obviously, I did start with a mask, a kind of Japanese warrior mask in the early days, but I kind of shed that eventually at some point. The reason for the name is because I'm generally a kind of solitary person. The channel's not gregarious Ronin Films. And Ronin is kind of from just the inspiration of seeing Yojimbo all those years ago. Kurosawa is probably my favorite director. Even my email address is kind of partly a bit of Kurosawa and a bit of John Sayles. So really, Solitary Ronin seemed like a natural name for the channel as opposed to using my real name. And that's how it kind of started and developed.
That's that's really wonderful. You mentioned sales and you mentioned Kurosawa there, and you mentioned so many things. Although I must admit, I'm now curious as to see if you start a second channel, calling it Gregarious Ronin. I'd like to see
Yes, that would be a different kind of channel. I'm not sure that'll ever happen, but never mind. Never mind. You never
well, if
know.
it does happen, please let us know. And the second, I think, right, it's you can have second channels and sub channels, so that might be interesting. Although I must say that your channel here, Solitary Ronin Films, I think is absolutely marvelous. And I think one of the reasons, out of many reasons, is that you obviously focus on cinema and the cinema that you love and you love to talk about, and also Blu-ray and collecting and the like. But what I really love is the focus that you have and the discussions that you have on, say, various filmmakers that deserve so much attention, but
Yeah.
maybe, let's say, for whatever reason, maybe within this particular space or this particular maybe community of conversations, there's so many films out there, too many to be able to
Yeah.
cover at once. And so I think the filmmakers that you cover are those that are really, how should I put it, the more attention given to them, the better off I think we all are. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think I learned a long time ago you need to do what you're kind of interested in doing rather than what you think other people would be interested in watching. Um, and for me, there are just filmmakers that are more interesting because of their subject matter. Everybody looks at filmmakers differently. You know, there's filmmakers that I haven't seen a lot of, that people might kind of reel back in horror about. You know, I haven't seen a lot of Fellinis. I've only seen 2 or 3 Ozus, but that's just because I haven't got around to them. Because, like you say, there's so many films, it's difficult to kind of see every single film ever made. Perhaps you have your Criterion collection, which is always impressive, but it's difficult to kind of keep track of absolutely everything. But again, filmmakers who do certain subject matters that you're less interested in, then obviously you're not going to watch them. You might watch them at some point down the road, but you're not going to immediately draw yourself to those ones.
No, that's a very interesting perspective. And as you say, there's just so much out there, perhaps too much for someone to be able to keep up with, you know, not to mention the continual input and of new stuff that's coming out. So how to
Yeah.
keep up with the new stuff and trying to
Yeah.
keep up with stuff that's already been released, you know,
I mean, one
it's
of my kind of holes in my knowledge or collection is modern films. You know, I don't really catch up with that many kind of new films just because I've got such a backlog of like old films. Um, so there are like modern filmmakers like Kim Ji-woon and Yorgos Lanthimos and people like that that I obviously keep an eye out for and watch whatever they're doing. But in general, modern films kind of pass me by. I'll kind of get to them once I've cleared all the other years of cinema behind me, but that's going to take a bit of a while.
just for my information, how do you define modern films?
Yes. Um, Probably anything in the last 10 years or so, because I have so much stuff to get through, because unfortunately you have to work for a living as well. Life does get in the way of film watching, which is sometimes a bit difficult, but you have to accept that. So there are kind of, I've got box sets of people still to watch, so it's like modern films I'll kind of get to at some point, unless, you know, something really pops. But again, one of the great things about part of the YouTube film community is you get new recommendations all the time from people. But obviously, there's a downside to that as well because you have to add it to the list, and then you get, you know. But the community is so good, and you'll know that yourself, Daisuke. People recommending films that you're maybe not aware of, and then you watch them and go, "How have I spent all these years without seeing this film?" Um, but obviously, that just builds to the huge, embarrassing backlog that I have. So, and modern films, unfortunately, are kind of a casualty of that.
Well, at the same time, of course, you are focusing in on, as you say, those films that, for the reasons that hopefully we can can hear a little bit about today mean something to you or mean a lot to you.
Yeah.
And let's get into that. And I suppose I have to start with that first example that you gave, Kurosawa, Akira
Yeah.
Kurosawa. You mentioned, and you said he is your favorite filmmaker, probably your favorite filmmaker,
Yeah.
or among your favorite filmmakers,
Yeah.
let's say.
He's
So could
certainly top five.
certainly top five. Okay, so that means I have to ask who are the other four in the moment. But that
Well,
means let's start with Kurosawa first. What are some of those films that you say as an example of Kurosawa's work really mean a lot to you, and maybe using those, could you explain a little bit as to why Kurosawa's works mean the way they do to you?
well, for me, the reason Kurosawa is my favorite, and in my opinion, but obviously my opinion is not fact. Nobody's opinion is fact. Um, is his shot composition. His shot composition, Orson Welles, Sergio Leone, Kubrick, their shot composition is excellent. I just think Kurosawa's shot composition, where he places characters in the frame in relationship to each other. The Bad Sleep Well is a perfect example. The first half, or sorry, High and Low, the first half of that film is in a room essentially, but it's absolutely riveting, and it's because of the positioning of the characters, the relationship between each other, whether they're sitting, whether they're standing. Um, Also, his dynamic camera. Now, obviously, later on, when he got older, that dynamic camera became more static, but that's fair enough. He was making films when he was still like 80 or whatever. And also, he did different types of films, from his modern era films, I Live in Fear and Kuru and things like that, to also the Jideki and the period pieces, Throne of Blood. He also did Shakespeare, did The Idiot, Dostoevsky, just because he did so many different things well. The shot composition, the dynamic camera. Um, to me, that's just some of the reasons why he's so good.
That's great. That's so the compositions, the dynamic camera, the dynamism of certain, let's say, a period of his career. And I think you very astutely also mentioned the later part of his career, maybe the penultimate films or the ones that came in the 80s onwards, using a more, as you say, static camera. But I think there's nothing wrong with that. And also there is
Oh,
a certain type of artistry that is involved. It's almost like the even though the camera might be still, there's so much going on. You know what I mean?
yeah.
That's
I
yeah.
mean, Kagemusha and Ran are almost like frescoes, and also the fact that he used multiple cameras
Yeah.
throughout his career. Um, I've always said you can pause any Kurosawa film. You could probably say that about Orson Welles or Kubrick. You could pause it, print it, and put it up in an art gallery, and you would just have the most amazing collection of paintings in a gallery.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. And also, it reminds me too about how Kurosawa was very famous too for how he composed his shots, or how he imagined his compositions to begin with, in terms of
Yeah.
his own drawings and paintings that themselves became very famous in terms of what it was he was trying to imagine. For example, I think you mentioned Kagemusha and Ran as being examples of that. I agree. Also, there is this idea of his using a type of how shall I put it? There's a use of a um, he is trying to use the moment, and so I use the phrase theatrical. There's a theatricality, as in theater, with a lot of his films, but especially the later part. And I think that that could be seen as a negative, but I think it actually, I use it as a very complimentary way, or at least I mean to. And I think because there's something quite magical about him trying to use what's there at the moment that can just dissipate and disappear
Yeah.
and be lost in time forever. Ron is a great example. You know, you let's wait until there is this storm and then let's
Yeah.
shoot this major sequence outside in the rain and the wind and the storm, and it can last only for a moment, but we must catch this very crucial moment with the characters, the main character of Hidetora, and then there's another moment. I don't want to get into too much detail, but one of my favorite moments is there's a major character and they're sitting in this type of maybe I guess a lack for a better word, like a throne room, this empty throne room, and there's a one character that comes, a kind of a retainer type of character, and he comes in with this package of some kind, and you don't quite know what it is, and the unraveling of the package, and it has this flourish that happens all at once, but you know that it happened in one kind of take, and it had to happen in a certain way. Things had to fall and tilt in a certain way, and it all had to happen. It couldn't be, a special effect. It had to happen in the moment. And so those are great examples of how there's even so much excitement and dynamism in the air, even where the camera is so-called maybe static. There's some kind of energy in that, in the use of the based theater that is so wonderful. And yet, I'm sorry. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
You mentioned the weather, and obviously you can look at Seven Samurai and Throne of Blood, especially I don't think there's been a director that uses wind and rain, obviously fog in the case of Throne of Blood, which is also a plot point as well. But you do get a sense of the elements being a character. The final battle in Seven Samurai is just an absolute masterclass in multiple cameras, and it's But I'm not to do a gratuitous plug or anything, but I'm doing a series on the channel of Kurosawa before Rashomon, because everybody is kind of familiar with Kurosawa after Rashomon. But there's 10 films before Rashomon, so I've done 3 of them. Because he said himself it wasn't until about the 7th one that he was kind of getting his own identity and his kind of feeling. So I'm kind of doing that as well.
No, that's great, because that career, that part of his career before Rashomon, right?
Yeah.
So up to 1950 is very key, and there are so many powerful works. I mean, you mentioned the weather, and you mentioned the integration of the weather and the landscape. I mean, you look at a film.
Sanshiro Sugata,
exactly.
obviously.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, the end of both films. Unfortunately, the print for part 2 is not great. So that end scene it's not ruined, but it's not a great print that, well, I've got anyway. But certainly the scene at the end of the first Sanshiro Sugata film is just jaw-dropping. So even in a truncated version of the film, even as a debut, you kind of could tell he knows what he's doing from a technical standpoint.
That's for sure. And how to build action and suspense.
Yeah,
and integrate it into the environment, and then how to have that integration somehow tell something about the struggle of the characters. It's all in the moment. I mean, you mentioned Seven Samurai as well. I have to say, before I go to my next question, is there's something very powerful about how he uses weather and the elements and the mud and the rain. Like mud suddenly becomes the stand-in for blood and sweat. You know what I mean? And it also becomes this equalizing force. Everyone is covered in the mud. Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
It becomes a leveler for the bandits who are not skilled. And then like the master samurai who spent all these years in training to hone his skill, and that weather and the mud, obviously the weapon as well, but that levels out any skill, which again is another powerful issue in the film.
Yes, exactly. You said it so wonderfully, and I agree. And it's also with the farmers and that community, and everyone is one, which is, I think, a very powerful, nuanced statement in and of itself that can be taken within the film, but also can be taken outside of the film in maybe another sort of macro context. But
because I mean, Seven Samurai, perhaps not that it's dismissed, but it's kind of go, oh yeah, it's great, it's Seven Samurai, but people kind of forget how great that film is and how much of a template film it is, obviously, because it's been remade about 78 times. Plus, it's one of the few films where when people die, you genuinely miss them and you are genuinely upset about it. You can completely identify with the rookie samurai at the end when he pretty much just drops to his knees, because you do feel the loss of these characters just because they're such rich characters. And obviously in cinema, that's not always the case. People are disposable and you don't really feel much when people die in a lot of films. But Seven Samurai, you do feel that weight. Well,
No,
I
that
think
is
so.
no, that is an excellent point. Yes, there is a weight to the proceedings when something big happens in the plot, even fairly early on when something happens, it
Yeah.
actually is very heavy, and there is this type of triumph over tragedy, but the tragedy element is still there. Also, there's this interesting way that you're right, even the more maybe it's how we say characters in the periphery get this sense, their spotlight moment,
Yeah.
and we get to know these people in these very daily routine ways, and it's a kind of a real treat. It's not even a sense of realism. There's definitely a sense of things being set
Yeah.
up in this world, but still there's this mix of heightened reality and theater, and then also the elements that we can still understand. Like if
Yeah.
it were just heightened reality and theater, that I think that would still be great, but he throws in, as you say, the mud and the wind and the blood and the sweat and the tears, as it were, and that
Yeah.
gives us our root in, and when we are swept in, you're right, it's totally
It's like
exhilarating.
Yojimbo when you go back to the theatricality of it and the composition,
Yeah.
because Japanese architecture of that time lends itself to composition because everything is essentially a frame. You know, when Mifune is in The Innkeeper, they're looking through frame-sized windows or frame-sized slats, which is a composition in itself. And then you get the composition of the actual action. So it's just masterclass cinema as far as I'm concerned.
And you're right too. There's this type of use of right angles in
Yeah.
that film Yojimbo. Even the way that the town is almost in this right angle type of. There are a couple roads and then some buildings, but they're all in these right angles. So it's this way or this way and this way. So there's a sense of order that is placed almost subliminally by use of, as you say, the camera work and the framing, even though the world that is being depicted is anything but orderly. It is actually
Yes.
quite chaotic. It's probably one of the most chaotic worlds that we have seen,
Yes.
perhaps in any Kurosawa film. I would suggest maybe, I mean,
Yeah.
it could almost be like Ran. Maybe Yojimbo could have been called Ran back in the day, but with
Yeah.
the word Ran being
As
chaos.
soon
But
as the
still.
dog comes out of the hand in its mouth, you know what you're in for. So it's
Yeah, and the look on Mifune's face when he sees what that is, yeah, and he kind of turns around. Huh? What? Even Mufune is like, what is this? So
and again, it's one of those films where the hero just acts because he's bored. You know, there's no romantic angle. There's no money is used, but that's not why he does it. He pretty much does it because he's bored, which is a kind of rare way of setting the action in motion, really, in films.
that's such a great point. Yeah, that's one of the most iconic characters I think ever. I love
How he
that
uses his
characterization.
shoulders. It's like,
And the way that the film starts, you have these mountains, and suddenly this mountainous figure, this legendary figure, comes in the frame, and you see him from behind, just starts scratching the back of his head, and the music starts. Yeah, it's amazing. So Yojimbo. So I'm so sorry. I'm getting carried away because I too love Kurosawa.
it's
So
easily done.
and so just before we move on, let me ask you, could you give us some recommendations for Kurosawa films, just in case anyone hasn't seen Kurosawa films yet? What films could you recommend to people as some of your favorites?
Well, Throne of Blood might be my favourite. Derzu Zala, which sadly is one that perhaps doesn't have. Well, I think there's maybe like an Italian Blu-ray. I don't know if there's a Japanese Blu-ray, but that's such a beautiful film. It could almost be silent. And again, it's probably it's one of his early color ones. I think it's after the Descadene. But that's a really underrated one. It's actually quite moving. But a couple of the early ones I will be covering, Drunken Angel and Stray Dog. Stray Dog especially is just wonderful. It's those kind of early pairings of Shimura and Mifune. It's actually surprising, well, to me, that in fact Shimura appears right in the debut, and he did more Kurosawa films than Mifune did. But they're all excellent ones. Obviously, Yojimbo, Sanjuro. Sanjuro, the light, happy one, but then it has a devastating ending, which kind of just brings you back down to earth with a bang.
That is wonderful, my friend. That is wonderful. And so Kurosawa is one of those filmmakers for you. And
Yeah.
you also mentioned another big one, which is John Sayles.
Yes.
And so I must ask you, my friend, again, same type of question, which is, and this is a really big one too, which is,
Yes.
so what are some examples of the John Sayles works that really sing to you? And using that, could you let us in as to why his works resonate for you the way they do, which is really brilliant, by the way.
Well, we might as well start with Matewan, which was actually quite moving when it got a Criterion release for me, because it's such a great film. It's still relevant. It is about one of those periods in American history that not even Americans really knew about. Lone Star, which was the one he kind of got a little bit of fame because he got nominated for an Oscar. And then he immediately, his next film was Men with Guns, set in Central America, that had very little English language. That's how he kind of responds to get an Oscar nod. Passion Fish, which might be my favourite film. Myself and a friend always say your favourite John Sayles film is the one you just watched last. And City of Hope. But for me, the thing that stands out for John Sayles, because I'll be controversial and say he is the best American writer-director of the last 40 years, which is obviously a bit of a wild statement, but I think it's true. And the reason is his ear for dialogue. It doesn't matter whether he is writing for black, white, straight, gay, old, young. So many films, you hear dialogue and you just go, oh, that just doesn't sound like that character would say that, or it's just jarring. You never get that in a Sayles film. He just has a keen ear for dialogue. He knows people. You know, how many films do we watch that a character has an amazing speech and you go, that's an amazing monologue, but people don't really talk like that in real life. Sayles knows people have like moments of grace or a line or two of really pithy wisdom, but they don't have like huge monologues in real life. And his incisive character beats are just so good. And his films, take Passion Fish. I think one of the issues that Sayles isn't more famous than he is because if you read out the synopsis of his films, you just go, what? Why would I watch that? You know, a soap opera actress gets paralyzed in an accident, goes to her home in Louisiana, goes through a series of home helps until she meets Alfred Woodard and that relationship. People would go, why would I watch that? That sounds like a TV movie, soap opera. And it's like, but the characters are so rich. It's like a 2.25 hour film and you want it to be a 10-hour film. That's why Sayles is so good. You want to stay with those characters for a lot longer than the film. And that is just true great writing as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah,
Sorry
no. I'm so glad you mentioned John Sayles and you gave the example, so many examples. I must join you in your championing of those films, like Passion Fish, for example. That
Yeah.
was a film that was released in the early 90s, and it was one of those films that I saw first
Yeah.
during this period when I was beginning to discover more cinema and going to the theater, because that had a kind of theatrical release for a little bit.
Yeah.
um and it had because I think because it was marketed as this type of maybe not quite part of this, maybe how should I put it, it wasn't it, it was still marketed, I think, not quite as an independent film because of the pedigree, shall we say,
Yeah.
of the performers involved. But it was a kind of it 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 had a lot of this critical attention, well
Yeah.
deserved, and so it was a marvelous thing to watch that. And then the I think the one that, as you mentioned, gets a lot of attention is Lone Star, and so that came also in the
Yeah.
90s, and that was just but Passion Fish in particular, I saw that so many
Yeah.
times, and
Passion
it
Fish is
was,
just beautiful.
and you're absolutely right. It really is this type of it's this type of story where you think, what is this? Right?
Yeah.
It's this type of thing, but you think about it, and you realize, or I begin to realize, this is why I love cinema, which is
Yeah.
that it gives us this window into a world that I wouldn't maybe necessarily think about
Oh,
in my own life, you know what I mean? And it's not like
yeah.
this far out universe. It's just something that could happen in an everyday way
Yeah.
that still is totally not parallel with what it is I'm living, but still becomes this remarkable experience through daily
Yeah.
lived in experiences, you know what I mean? As you, I think, so well described it.
But like you say, that's why cinema is so great, because you can see a culture or a subject matter that you have no experience of, and you're drawn into that world. If there's rich characters, you're just drawn into it, and it doesn't matter what country it's from or what those people are doing. If it's well done and well written, you just get drawn into it. And I think that's one of the things why Sales isn't more popular. One, his films are socio-political in some level, and I guess he is left-leaning, and that might put some people off. And also, like I said, the synopses of his films. Let's have a film in the, about West Virginia miners. Well, that will be a huge box office. And it's like, yeah, not really, but that's what he's interested in.
But as you say, I think, for instance, with some of those releases, like the Criterion Collection,
Yeah,
uh, somewhat recently, and elsewhere, hopefully, then this will be a filmmaker. Hopefully, will get as
yeah,
much attention as he deserves. Because I agree with you. I think he is one of the greats. He is
yeah.
one of the absolute greats, and it's
Again,
like,
he's one of the long list of filmmakers that learned under Corman and then went
yeah,
on to have careers of their own.
yeah,
His genre films for
yeah.
Corman are wonderful. I haven't even mentioned Limbo, with one of the greatest endings of all time. Another just wonderful film.
My goodness, I think this is probably going to be one of those filmmakers who will, as I say, hopefully get more attention, let's say among film fans, as his
Yeah,
films hopefully become more, shall we say, more readily available, and the like. But of course, it's something that you are shining a light on a lot
yeah. I mean,
on your channel.
I know I tend to bang on about it a bit, but his last film, Go for Sisters, with Edward James Olmos,
Hmm.
he made for $1 million, and he had to get from like 4 different countries to finance that. And it is kind of, it's upsetting that he has to kind of do all of that and scrabble for money, but that's just unfortunately the nature when you're an independent filmmaker and you're making films of that kind of subject matter.
Well, no, that's actually really a nice way to ask you what my next question was, which is that one of the things that I really, really love about your channel, which is what I mentioned a few moments ago when we started this conversation, which is that you are putting a great spotlight on a number of films and filmmakers that I I personally uh, I love these films and I love these filmmakers' works, and it's very excellent too because it's one of these things. It's a kind of a tricky thing, as you say, trying to figure out what to talk about
Yeah,
on, say, a YouTube channel. But your topics are talking about those that maybe how should I put it? Uh, they aren't the most spoken about, or they aren't the most discussed.
yeah,
They should be. They're really fantastic and so stellar. um but as you say, the cinema is so vast an ocean, it's hard to talk
yeah.
about everyone, but you are
Channels.
talking about those
Yeah,
very special filmmakers in a very special way. So
yeah. I
could
mean,
you
my channel
maybe,
is a
yeah.
niche of a niche of a niche of a niche. That's how
No,
I
I
look at
don't
it.
think so. No, no, no. I don't think I wouldn't I don't think so. On the contrary, I think this is a type of important uh spotlighting. And so maybe, I don't know if I would use the word niche. I would say instead it's like putting a spotlight on something that's there, but that should be talked about as much as possible. So
Yeah.
it's already there, but it's just we need a lot of people to talk about this. So
Well,
I'm
I certainly feel about that with Saiji Ray that I did a series on.
yeah.
Because to me, he's like one of the world cinema masters that nobody talks about enough. And unfortunately his films just aren't that readily available, which again, um, it's a shame. But hopefully one day, obviously Charulata is coming out on UK Criterion in April, I believe. So I'm looking forward to that. But again, lots of his films you just can't get a hold of.
So, I mean, so you mentioned, yes, thank you. So you mentioned Ray, and you also there were other films like Chabrol, and also um, uh, like Mamet, and so
Yeah.
could you give us maybe this might be also another way to a great way to describe the work that you do on your channel. So what are some of those filmmakers that you focus on, and how and what is your process by which you discuss these filmmakers' works on your channel? Could you give us a little bit of insight into the types of filmmakers that you
Um,
you do you talk about, and how you assess or how you approach their works for purposes of your discussions?
well, I think of it again. I think first of all, you have to be a bit selfish about what you're going to talk about. It has to interest you. And to be honest, it gives me an excuse to watch the films or rewatch the films, because sometimes otherwise they'll just sit in the shelf. So on a selfish basis, it actually means you get to watch those films. Um, Perhaps with Chabrol, it wasn't my wisest choice considering he's made 74 films, and I'm still granted I think I've got 6 left of the series, which will still only be 31 videos. So that's not even half of his output. So that's why I did the Kurosawa before Rashomon. It's like only 10. I'm hoping to do the Dardenne brothers, which again is a smaller amount of films. Um, so perhaps Chabrol wasn't a bit off a bit more than I can chew, but we're getting there. Slowly, we're getting there. And it has been enjoyable getting through those. It's just kind of filmmakers that I kind of naturally lend to. It kind of goes back to what I was kind of saying about what attracts you to filmmakers. So for better or worse, for example, let's take Ozu. Okay, the two films by Ozu that I've seen, Tokyo Story and Late Spring, are both masterpieces. And I have a load of Ozu in my backlog, which I will get to at some point. But you can obviously tell me I'm wrong, and I'm sure lots of people will tell me I'm wrong. But my perception of Ozu is his films are about families and relationships within those families and the dynamics of that. And again, just on a personal level, I don't really relate to those films as much as other people do, because again, that's just back to your personal preference. And again, the two films that I've seen, I have loved. So, but again, it's just filmmakers you're kind of drawn to because of your perception of them. So, for example, Fellini, I have only seen 8.5. And again, it was kind of what I thought my perception of Fellini was. So it had moments of genius in it, but I kind of felt it also had a little self-indulgence. So I haven't seen loads of Fellini, for example, but at some point I will. It's just I'm not drawn to Fellini immediately the way I'm drawn to Saijit Ray, for example, because I identify with what Saijit Ray is talking about more. And again, I think you just have to go through that process yourself. And it's really what you're interested in. And it's not to denigrate anybody else or any other filmmakers, because you'll get to them eventually. But in life, you just have to prioritize things. So some filmmakers just jump to the head of the queue, essentially. If that's any explanation, I'm not sure it is, but
No, that is, and that's wonderful. And there's absolutely no need to say apologize for maybe not giving a certain level of attention to some filmmakers over others at this point in your life, right? I mean, you mentioned Ozu as maybe one of those examples of that, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And also, there's nothing wrong even if you watch an Ozu film and don't like it. There's absolutely nothing
yeah.
wrong with that either. The same goes for a Fellini film. I mean, there's no rule in life that says one has to love and admire and right, say filmmakers A, B, and C. So there, and in fact, I think that kind of engagement is what makes the conversations very interesting. Which is like, I mean, I think what you said there, for instance, about why you are not engaged in Ozu films at the moment in your life, I find that to be a
Yeah.
very interesting conversations, because you say they're talking about these certain themes as you perceive them to be, which I think is a very accurate perception. And you're saying, therefore, it doesn't necessarily resonate with me as much as others, at least at this point in my life, even though I have seen certain films by him and I regard them as being very moving. I think that's a very powerful and well
Yeah.
stated perspective.
Well, you can
Truly, I
see,
do.
sorry, you can tell how odd I am because my favourite Corrida film is Airdoll. You know, obviously still walking is fantastic as well, but my favourite Corrida film, I haven't seen all these films, but my favourite one's Airdoll. That kind of sums up who I am. You know, I'm more drawn to Jean-Pierre Melville than Eric Romer. But again, that's just me. But you know,
But that's great. I think that really that gives us a sense also about who you are and what your cinema journey is. And I've always
yeah,
said this, which is it's always about the discussion of the cinema journey is always about finding out who you are and learning about people. I've always said you can learn so much about someone if you ask them what their favorite movies are, and it's if they say what it is they really feel. I think that's a really powerful statement. And so, but actually, that leads me to another question for you, which is you're mentioning these filmmakers that you are, say, attracted to, or maybe filmmakers that you are maybe haven't necessarily been engaged with so far in your
yeah,
own life and cinema journey, shall we say. That could change, of course, on a given moment's notice. But as of now, you are right now where you are and who you are in your cinema journey. But that leads me to the question is, how did your journey start? What were some of those inspirational moments early in your life that say inspired you to become the cinema lover that you are? And what were some of those example milestone moments along the way in your life as you were watching films growing up that
Yeah.
really clung to you as an
Um,
experience?
well, I guess I work in genetics. Okay, so we all want to think that we're unique and we're not affected by anything else. But the fact of the matter is, our parents have a big influence on us and how we think and how we act. So I think my dad was probably an influence in the sense when he was young in the 60s, he went to a film club and saw world cinema films. He always talked about Rififi. He told stories about taking his dad to see Lawrence of Arabia. And of course, his dad thought he was just going to go in for a couple of hours, and obviously it's not a couple of hours. And it was on one of the big surround screens, and that blew his dad away. And obviously, Lawrence of Arabia is now one of my favourite films. So there's some kind of influence, yeah, there's some kind of influence from my dad, I think, as far as being tuned to world cinema. Obviously, it's not world cinema if you're in Japan. It's Japanese cinema. But because I think I was never a barrier with non-English language films. How some people say I just can't watch them because I've got to read and watch at the same time. I never felt that. It just seemed natural. So world cinema, calling it world cinema, but non-English language cinema always just felt natural. There was films when I was young, before I kind of knew what a director was or what they did, like The Good, the Bad and Ugly, which I probably saw about 30 times, that I always loved. And then when you actually knew what was going on, you just love them even more. Probably started collecting when I was maybe like 15 or 16, back in the days of VHS, if people remember VHS. And then you end up collecting all these films in different formats, the same film. We won't talk about the fact I've got 14 different editions of the Thing. That's just my thing about the Thing. So it was really, and again, because I am not gregarious Ronin Films, there is an element of living life vicariously through cinema. And again, it goes back to seeing cultures, seeing people that you don't see in your everyday life, and kind of getting a view into those worlds. And I think that kind of affected me as well. And again, that's why world cinema is so important to me, as well as obviously Hollywood or whatever. Yeah, I don't. That is a probably long-winded and boring answer, but never mind.
Oh, no, not at all. I think that's brilliant. That's really lovely. And that's really, really lovely. And you mentioned the influences that you had growing up, and then the influences on the influences, as it were, which is
Yeah.
really quite lovely. And so, and it links to early moments of cinema. And I pointed to Lawrence of Arabia, and I couldn't help but notice the background there, which is very prominent and wonderfully so. And then you also mentioned the VHS days and the like. What were some of those examples of those films that you were seeing, say, in the theater, and also the VHSs, for example?
Well, I remember I was old enough to see Raiders of the Lost Ark and Return of the Jedi in the cinema, and then one of the local cinemas was actually showing the 3 Star Wars films in a row. So we all took like packed lunches to the cinema and was there all day watching Star Wars. Obviously, I don't feel the same way about Star Wars now that I did then, but never mind. I still have the action figures. And then he started collecting tartan video because the local stores didn't really know what they would have. I remember a kind of local newsagent had Man Bites Dog from like 1992, just in, which probably they shouldn't have been selling, but never mind. And then when I went to university, there was a cinema in the university. So I saw lots of films in the early 90s, from Sneakers and Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me and Hard Boiled. That was my first John Woo experience, was in the cinema, seeing Hard Boiled, which literally blew me away and blew quite a lot of other people away. Because I'd heard, oh yeah, there's such a high body count. And I was like, yeah. And after 10 minutes, you just stop counting. It's just like, what's the point? It's like, you'd have to sit with a wee clicker to go. So Hard Boiled was just an amazing experience. But Fire Walk with Me, obviously, I had watched Twin Peaks, the series, but Fire Walk with Me was an amazing experience in the cinema as well. So I got to see a lot of films in the early 90s, actually, in the cinema. But I don't tend to go to the cinema that much because I've got my projector, so I'd much rather just watch films and physical media on the projector at home. Obviously, can at the moment anyway, but
I must ask you, you mentioned when you were in university, you mentioned a number of titles as examples. Hard Boiled, you mentioned Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me, you mentioned. You also mentioned, the film Sneakers? Is that right?
Phil Alden Robinson's lovely little caper film,
Yeah, that's the
which
one.
is so underrated.
Robert Redford.
Yeah, Sidney Poitier.
Yes. I love that film.
Yeah, it's so underrated.
Yes,
They just don't make films like that anymore.
I love that film.
What a cast, Dan Aykroyd and River Phoenix.
River Phoenix, yes.
James Earl Jones with a little cameo.
I'm so glad you mentioned that film as well, Sneakers, because that one I saw, I saw it when it was, I didn't see it in the theater, but I saw it later when it was released on home, like rental, VHS, I think. And that was one I would watch over and over again. It was an amazing film.
Yeah. Ben Kingsley has
I don't yes, I don't hear anyone speaking about it that much. I'm so sorry, I don't know. Does that have a DVD or Blu-ray release?
Blu-ray release, certainly in the UK, yeah.
It does?
Yeah.
Oh.
No boutique label or anything, it's just a bog standard. I'm not sure, is it Universal maybe? I'm not sure the studio, but it does have a Blu-ray release in the UK.
I love that film so much. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's seen, but there's a moment where one of the characters has to, like, right? He has to, you know what I mean? Yeah, that's
and how they get past the password. And all the security systems is just wonderful.
And it's funny.
It's just that good old-fashioned caper movie that they just don't make anymore. It's not cynical. It's wonderful. And
it's surprising, and it can make some certain turns that you're not quite sure what's going to happen next. And so I'm trying to be very careful here. I don't want to.
When Ben Kingsley's like, wait a minute, a computer matched him with her. I don't think so. Ben Kingsley's wonderful.
Oh, what an amazing film. I'm so glad you mentioned that. So again, that's another one that deserves as much attention as it can get. Oh, it is. It's what a great. Oh, I'm so okay. So, I'm so sorry. I'm getting so carried away here. I apologize. But so yes. So then that brings us to you mentioned then from the university experience and watching films, and then you also mentioned at the tail end of that, which is now you watch films obviously for a number of reasons, right? You watch films at home with your projector, and then the various films that you have, say, on the shelves, and what you get from certain labels, etc. So does that mean then that as of now, your film consumption is more or less based on, say, physical media product? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't tend to stream. I've got enough of a backlog, so it's pretty much physical media at home, because again, you get extras, and sometimes the extras are better than the film. Is that certainly in some releases? I think, you know which ones I mean. Perhaps some Arrow videos, the early 80s slashers, some of them are of differing quality, so sometimes the making of documentaries are actually more interesting. But that's a side issue.
Well, no, actually, could you give us some examples of maybe some of those physical media releases where you think those making ofs or the documentaries or the supplements really stood out?
Well, as an example of being better than the actual film, the slasher Trapped Alive, which is one of those Wisconsin-made down a mine films, which isn't very good, but there's like an hour-long making of, which a retrospective, which is really good because it goes. This was a studio that pretty much, built everything in the snow in Wisconsin and made several kind of cheap slasher films, and that was kind of interesting because there's still a desire, a passion to make these films, even though they end up perhaps not being that great. Obviously, it's subjective, but stuff like that is really interesting. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Indicator, and their extras just go kind of above and beyond. Sometimes those extras are just wonderful in Indicator, especially the box sets. For example, the Fu Manchu box set, which the films aren't the best, let's be honest, but the extras, the historical kind of documentaries, the commentaries that they do with people like Kevin Lyons and of course Kim Newman, who I think everybody's familiar with and loves, and Jonathan Rigby, who's wonderful as well. But again, if you're just into the films and you're not bothered about finding out the history and stuff, then obviously streaming is absolutely fine. But for me, I just love that physical media and actually holding something in your hand, which sounds bizarre, but that's just the way it is.
Oh no, that I mean that doesn't sound bizarre at all. I think that's a very reasonable and legitimate way to consume this particular type of product. And so I think there's something of a tangible nature that really enhances the experience in some way. I don't know
Yeah,
if that makes any sense, but there's this way that's, you know what I mean? Cinema is
yeah,
so it's just an amorphous intangible thing because it's just an
yeah,
image, but it's something that you're conjuring up, but you can't really feel it or touch it or engage
yeah,
with it or interact with it physically, and so you have to there's some kind of very there's this interesting way of this type of maybe ritual that's developed in terms of getting the item, opening it in the
yeah,
machine, and that sort of thing, and setting up the time, and also but there's also this way of interacting. I mean, I know there's the cover art, and that's a big deal, obviously,
yeah,
but there's I think it for me too. It just goes into this type of let's say I know it's not quite interactive, but it has
yeah,
this tangible quality that lends itself an extra level of connectivity, as it were. And also
yeah,
with streaming, it's I mean, Blu-rays and DVDs too have the same issue, although it's slightly drawn out in a slightly different way, I would say. But with streaming, there's always the issue of what version that you're getting.
yeah,
I mean, the type of version you're getting in terms of presentation, but also the type of version that you're getting in terms of the actual edited version. And so
yeah,
sometimes that, and a lot of times I think that can become quite an issue as to what version you want to watch of a particular film. And so
yeah,
at least with the physical media, there is the ability, hopefully, of being able to find the version. If it's
yeah,
OOP, that becomes a whole different
yeah,
that whole becomes a whole different a ball game, as it were. But still, there is this ability, I think, of trying to get that version that you feel, for whatever reason, you'd like to see of a particular film. And I think the physical media,
yeah.
to a large degree, affords that scope of opportunity.
I mean, having 13 editions of the thing's probably taken it a bit too far, but never mind.
13 editions, but it depends on what those editions are, perhaps. Like if there is a
Yeah,
if there is like a how should I put it? If there is no discernible difference between one release of a film versus another release, then I agree. I absolutely agree. And it's just I'm the cynical side of me will say that's just a money grab on the
yeah,
part of the release. So okay, yeah, I don't want to spend my money there, so no
yeah,
thank you, but no thank you. But if there is a something about the release that makes it different in terms of let's say take an easy example, like the version is different, if
Yeah.
it's a new edited version or something, then that is, I think, yeah. So yeah, I understand what you're saying about 13 different versions, but let's say among those 13 versions, maybe reasonably speaking, 3 or 4 of them are actually different,
Yes.
bringing something new to the table type of things. In that sense, I think it becomes quite an
Well,
interesting
for
film.
The
But
Thing, it's like one of them is genuine, the other 4 are imitation, obviously,
that becomes part of the kind of the
or just pretending to be a Blu-ray.
yeah, that becomes part of the challenge, actually, of trying to figure out as a consumer how best to spend one's money, right? And how,
Yeah.
right, is this really something that's bringing something new to the table, or is it, as you I think suggest quite rightly, is it just right, same old, same old? And so if that's the thing, I don't want to buy, right? It's something that I'm trying to how shall I decide how to spend my money? Of
Well, I
course,
did a
yeah.
sorry.
No,
I was just
please
going
go
to say I
ahead.
did a video recently on the 3 different versions of, or 3 different editions of Cronenberg's Crash that came out. So the Arrow, the Criterion, and a German media book, and they are all slightly different.
Yeah.
That's my excuse for having all 3, apart from I love the film. But
So that's an excellent example, and a recent example too. Excellent, because you're absolutely right. There is this idea of wanting that kind of how should I put it? There is this idea of wanting that kind of experience and different
yeah,
perspectives on the same film,
yeah,
especially
because you only
someone.
really do that for certain films.
And that's true, especially for a film like Crash, which I
Yeah,
think is a very it's a film that I think quite rightly encourages a lot of conversation. Let me put it that
yeah,
way. And I find it, actually, people call it a cold film. I actually find it to be one of the most
yeah,
emotionally powerful films
yeah,
in all of Cronenberg cinema. To be perfectly honest, I
yeah.
find it to be very emotional and about.
Bizarrely, I actually saw that in the cinema on a double bill with Microcosmos, which is this little French nature film. I saw Microcosmos first, and then pretty much went across the hall and saw Crash. It was an interesting double bill.
That's great. I too saw Crash in the theater when it was released.
Yeah,
And I remember I considered it a type of rite of passage because I had turned 17 and I was in the US at the
yeah,
time. And in the United States, they have this rating called NC-17.
yeah.
And I remember that film was given such a rating. And so
Because it was, yeah, I was just going to say it was interesting because there was people there. They ended up walking out because people, one, thought it was going to be an erotic thriller like Basic Instinct, which it obviously wasn't. Other people thought it was going to be really exciting with car chases, and which it's not. So it's, obviously appeal to Cronenberg fans, but it was obviously because of the media ban, people were expecting it to be something, and of course it's just not, which was always quite funny.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I really believe that it's a film that is and is not about sex in
Yeah,
an interesting way. And there is this way, it's always tough to talk about, or to deal. I think there's this interesting place that the subject matter of sexuality and human sexuality, and how what place that occupies in the sort of
yeah,
discourse of discussion of cinema. On the one hand, it is a very touchy subject, and it's a
yeah.
very sensitive topic for a number of people, and that's perfectly fine. But also, it's another way to look at it is it is a very it's undeniably a very important part
Yeah.
of human interaction and human existence.
And it's
Whether we
because
talk
these
about it or not,
characters,
it's very
yeah,
important. Yeah.
it's because these characters are beyond that, and they move beyond sex, which didn't make people, made people uncomfortable. Um, it's just fantastic and a challenging film. And because, again, Cronenberg, like a true artist, didn't make a moral stance, didn't tell the audience these people are deranged, these people are perverted, these people
Yeah.
are bad, don't do this, because he just didn't have a moral judgment. That confuses certain people who like to be told these people are bad. Tell us these people are bad. You know.
And that's absolutely right. I love how you describe it too, is going beyond the so-called I guess human sexual experience as we might understand it to be. Let's put it that way, and going beyond that in a way that the characters are exploring. And that is so much part of, I would suggest, the Cronenberg philosophy or cinematic aesthetic. I mean, people speak about body horror, the phrase body horror in Cronenberg, but in fact, the phrase body horror is, in essence, I would suggest, the phrase used to talk about the evolutionary leap that Cronenberg's films always involve themselves in. Whether that leap is in a quote unquote morally acceptable direction or not, that's a completely different conversation. There is an evolutionary leap from a character as he or she finds himself at one point early in the film versus where he or she finds himself at the latter half of the film. That is the leap. That is, and that's in right. That's the body horror aspect. But that's what Crash is, in this beautiful, elegant, and very poetic, and I would say still very emotional way in terms of the framing of the relationship. Right.
It's a film about evolution.
Yeah.
And it is actually quite moving at the end, where James Spader is like, maybe next time, you know, maybe we'll get to the next stage. And the sequel, Crash 2.
And so this is absolutely, I'm so glad you mentioned this as an example of the various versions that you have, because I think that's a film that's really the more conversations one engages with on that film, I think the more a great experience it becomes, potentially. Anyway, again, it's not for everyone, and it doesn't have to be, but
and Cronenberg, if you can get a commentary by Cronenberg, that's always absolute gold, because he's just one of those filmmakers you could listen to all day, like John Sayles and Michael Mann and David Mamet. His commentaries in House of Games and Homicide and the Criterion Collection are essential, because it gives you how to write a script, how to write a scene. So his commentaries are excellent as well.
That's really really lovely. And are there any other commentary tracks that I mean, you mentioned, of course, the great thing about physical media is the supplementary material and the variety potentially. Are there any other examples of great commentary tracks that really affected you?
Bizarrely, it might be surprising considering the quote-unquote mainstream nature of the films, but John McTiernan's Predator and Die Hard commentaries are absolutely wonderful, because he goes through how, even for a slight camera move, he had to argue with executives. On Die Hard, there's like a subjective camera move when they're like putting the detonators in the side or whatever, and he explains how he had to fight for that. And it's just interesting things like that. Obviously, in Predator, he talks about the moment where he's essentially taking the mickey by having them stand for 10 minutes shooting the jungle. You know, he deliberately put that in just to kind of criticize gun fanatics, essentially. So McTiernan's commentaries on those films, despite them being quote-unquote mainstream action films, his commentaries are really fascinating.
There we go. Ah, that's great. That is really great. I'm incident. I'm a big fan of Die Hard and Predator. I think those are and I think they have a huge fan base, obviously, but there is a type of there is a type of well, let me just say there, without going into too much detail, there is a real sense of wonderfully nuanced exhilaration that goes into those, and it's they are entertaining, but there's also there's a type of wonderful campy quality on the one hand. There's a lot of campiness, but then there's something that is, I think, very fundamental and deep rooted in a lot of what's going on there. Let me just, I'll leave it at that. But it's
they have wonderfully quotable dialogue. Let's be honest.
Oh, for sure. Yes. Let's see. But okay, so there's the John McTiernan commentary tracks with those great films. Are there any others? Other examples?
Um, Again, anything with Michael Mann, anything with John Sayles, Cronenberg, Mamet. I'm blanking on anything else. I mean, obviously, critics-wise, Kim Newman's always good, and Jonathan Rigby. I'm blanking on directors. Yeah.
Oh, I think those are great. No, those are great examples. And so that means obviously that as we were discussing earlier, this idea of the physical media or the consumption of the film product via the physical media product is it affords one, I think, as you suggested, with a lot of opportunity and avenues for various modes of discussion or approach to a particular film. There's the film itself, and there's also the stuff that can be generated in the discussion, excuse me, that can be generated as a result of that film discussion. So that's really quite wonderful. I think while we're on the topic, and there are a few more questions that I want to ask you, but while we're on the topic, are there any film recommendations or physical media recommendations that you might have for us, for anyone who might be watching from your collection or otherwise?
Well, I did a random review recently of a film that Chris Mohan mentioned in one of his watch list videos. So if you're not familiar with Chris Mohan, Mohan, you should go subscribe to his channel. But it's Vampire Kawadichuk, a Spanish film which, again, kind of sums up the magic of cinema. It's a film that kind of works but shouldn't work, and you don't know why it's worked or how it's worked. It's shot on the set of a Jess Franco Count Dracula film with Christopher Lee and Herbert Lom, but the director, Per Portobello, shot it silently in out-of-date black and white stock, used a kind of avant-garde score. He shoots the actors in costume, out of costume, before a scene, after a scene, but it also kind of works as a Count Dracula story. And again, you've no idea how or why. Part of the film, you're kind of going, this just makes no sense whatsoever and it's not working. Then all of a sudden, there's moments that just click, and you think, this reminds me of Dreyer's Vampire, this reminds me of Nosferatu, and this is one of the greatest Count Dracula films I've ever seen. And it's like, I have no idea how or why, and it just kind of speaks to the magic of cinema. It shows you the artifice of guys making the smoke and the smoke machines, and then it'll cut to the carriage and character coming through the fog through the woods, and you're immediately caught in that moment of that's Count Dracula's carriage, even though you've just seen the fakery involved seconds before. It's just a bizarre film. It's only 66 minutes. It really sums up Second Run as a boutique label, because they just put out interesting, sometimes experimental stuff. It's a bizarre film, but it kind of blew me away.
Oh, that's wonderful. And so let's see, are there any others films that you want to recommend? This is the space is all yours, my friend.
Well, a Criterion that I had never heard of, but I watched, I think it was last year. It's the Ballad of Gregorio Cortez with Edward James Olmos. It's a film from the 80s that I had never heard of, which isn't a surprise because I've not heard a lot of the films, but it literally just blew me away. It's still relevant. It's just a showcase for wonderful American character actors like James Gammon and Olmos. It's a story about language barrier. It's different cultures. It's still important today. It's just shot like beautiful old photographs. It's low budget, but it's absolutely sumptuous. And I would certainly recommend that. Again, I was not familiar with it, but it just blew me away.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, my dear friend, for that selection of recommendations. And I also want to ask you, the the work that you do in terms of cinema discussion is, I know, not limited just to your great YouTube channel, Solitary Ronin Films, which is great, by the way. But that's not the only
Thank you
thing
very
that you
much for
do,
saying.
right? In terms of your cinema discussions. Could you let us
Yes.
in on what other places or where else you discuss cinema and maybe the arts in general? I know that many people who might be watching this might know already, but just in case, could you let us know about those other places where you are discussing cinema and the arts?
Yeah, well, we do another channel with Nazarene Prod, Peter from Nazarene Prod, called Ronan Nazarene Talks, which is basically kind of free-form chats. Daisuke yourself has been very kind to be on that. We do director kind of chats going through their careers. So we've done like Paul Schrader and Richard Lester, who's a really underrated director when you actually think about how many great films he's made. We have done Decalogue in two parts per episode. We're kind of working our way through the Bergman box set, doing a couple of films. Apart from anything else, it means we actually get through the Bergman box set. And it's good to have two perspectives. So, for example, we did The Silence, which Nazarene Prod was a lot higher on than I am. But again, that's just subjective opinion, which is always good, rather than everybody just loving all the films. And we have guests on. We recently had Chris Mohan on. We did have audio issues with that, but we kind of passed off as it was an avant-garde experiment. But I'm not sure anybody bought that, but that's the narrative we were putting out. So that's kind of fun just to discuss directors. We've done Cronenberg, went through his career. So it's just a kind of easygoing chat, and because you have another perspective, it's always good to bounce ideas off.
That's really wonderful. And yes, thank you very much for that invitation, that time. I enjoyed myself
Yes,
immensely, and
good
it was a lovely discussion, and it was great to hear the two of you and your insights. I learned quite a lot. I'm also I'm very happy too that even or not even in this particular podcast, a collaboration that the two of you have with guests, and like you also try to talk about various maybe filmmakers and works, bodies of work that might not necessarily get as much attention as, say, other filmmakers. And so you mentioned, I'm so glad you mentioned filmmakers like Richard Lester, who's a very interesting filmmaker.
Yeah.
Unbelievable in terms of the scope and variety and just the depth of work that he does. And it's seemingly quite maybe, and I'm going to say, I'm trying to be careful here, but it might look to be very much surface level, but in fact it's not. There's actually there are many elements, and then there's a lot of things going, and even production wise, some of the times you get these great works and you realize, oh, he was probably he wasn't the first choice, or there were some issues that maybe he came in at the last minute or something, but still even with those works he was able to create these great masterpieces. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because
and the casts that he assembled, the casts that he got are just ridiculous. I mean, if you take Robin and Marion, which to me, again, it was a film that I saw years ago when I was young, and it didn't really resonate. And then I saw it again a couple of years ago in a better release, in a Blu-ray release, and it just blew me away. It's one of the, well, to me, it's the best Robin Hood film, and it's about an older Robin Hood. It's about growing old, kind of the consequences of legacy and myth. But that cast is ridiculous, with Sean Connery and Audrey Hepburn and Robert Shaw and Ian Holm and Richard Harris and Ronnie Barker, and it's ridiculous.
That's one of my favorites. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's almost the deconstruction of
Yeah.
of the myth, and also the type of almost anti-action film.
Yeah,
In
it could almost be a French New Wave film. It's got that kind of deconstructive feel.
Oh, that's such a great one. And I'm currently trying to assemble an idea for just a new, not quite series, but just a run of new videos that I will probably do, which is on 1970s disaster films.
Yes.
And so one of the greats in that is, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
Juggernaut.
Juggernaut, Richard Harris, and again Ian Holm and
Anthony
list goes on.
Hopkins and
Yeah.
David Hemmings, and it's Omar
But
Sharif.
you're right.
Yes.
But you're right. On the surface, that kind of just looks like, oh yeah, it's a disaster film. But again, there's so many levels to it, from satire to, you know, it's just wonderful.
Yes, yes, I agree. It's one of the best, and I can't wait. I don't think my discussion, I don't think my comments, I think, will not do justice to that great film. I can't speak highly enough about how brilliant that film is. That is one of the most well thought out, and it's amazing too to think about the production and how Richard Lester came in essentially and did what he did with such limited time. But it was the end result's the end result, and it's
yeah, it's funny, but it's also tense as well when it needs to be. It's unbelievably tense when it needs to be.
And Richard Lester is one of these filmmakers who I don't think he gets enough credit for how well he's able to juggle all these various types of genre, even sometimes in one film. I think one that gets maybe it gets a lot of maybe not backlash, but it's not, it doesn't, there's a lot of criticism directed against the film, like say Superman 3. But I think that's a remarkable film because it manages to balance, I think anyway, it manages to balance so many different types of cinema in one film. I mean, it's a superhero film, but it's also a slapstick comedy. It's also this type of a human drama, and it has this subtle commentary on class. And it's also a horror film, and so many. Oh my goodness, yeah. And but of course I understand.
Yeah, sorry.
No, please go ahead. I apologize.
One of my favorites is How I Won the War, which I've always loved, but it was always on kind of dirty DVD prints, and you could never really see what was going on. And then there's a Kino Lorber Blu-ray I got, and then Eureka, BFI released it in a beautiful print. I mean, How I Won the War is just amazing.
Oh my goodness! Talk about different elements.
And
yeah, even like the way that it's like, what is it? The way that characters interact with us, the viewer. It's amazing. Yeah,
with Wall and John Lennon's fantastic.
Yes, exactly. John Lennon. I was about to say yes. So, so there is so much artistry and creativity. I mean, it also goes into his work with the Beatles, Hard Day's Night, Hell. But right, those films too. There is this real artistry of how to turn things on a dime, and then he suddenly shifts things, and it goes back to something else, and then manages to pack in not just 1, 2, but 10 jokes into a single moment or scene, and it's timed perfectly. So the balance and the juggling act is amazing, and the type of variety is intense. Absolutely intense in Richard Lester's work, body of work.
You're right, he is so underrated because his name never comes up when people talk about great directors or great bodies of work.
What are some of your favorite Richard Lester films, by the way?
well, How I Won the War and Royal Flash, which again is not perfect, but it's got a ridiculous cast again, because I you get the feeling all the actors wanted to work with him. Um, it's a boy's own story, but it's based on somebody who's a liar, basically. Um, it's just an absolute blast. But How I Won the War, Robin and Marion, to me, are kind of two masterpieces.
And this is so wonderful because you have these various avenues of film discussion. Nazrin Prod's collaboration, of course, and I had the great honor of having him on as a guest a
Yeah,
few weeks back, and he was a really marvelous guest to have really thoughtful and lovely discussions. And so there's that collaboration. There's also your own solitary
yes.
great channel, Solitary Ronin Films. And so maybe without giving too much away, could you let us in on a little bit of what you might be planning in the near future for both of these channels, these projects?
Um, well, I've just started an Aki Kaurismäki season. I think I've done 3 films of his so far, because again, he's a filmmaker that's not really talked about. Um, and for me, I love Jim Jarmusch, and I always have this in my head that Kaurismäki is kind of like the Finnish Jarmusch. That's maybe unfair, but um, as far as the importance of music in his films, the kind of deadpan humor, making films about people smoking, yes, making films about people that other directors don't really talk about or aren't really interested in. They kind of focus on those kind of characters, which is wonderful. Um, and then if I ever finish my Chabrol Odyssey, which has almost become a running joke, um, I was kind of think, like I said, I mentioned the Dardenne brothers, because again they have a kind of finite number of films, which always helps. And maybe I might go crazy and look at Alain Resnais, because again his body of work's quite big, but again he has some amazing films, including for me one of the most underrated is Mon Oncle Amerique, which I absolutely love and might be the best film of the 80s. But again, nobody really talks about that one. So that would be interesting as well. Again, I still do double takes and or talk about 2 films either by an actor or just kind of comparing versions of films or whatever. Just a load of stuff. And again, Chris Mohan did a lovely video on having a small channel and kind of the advantages of that, as far as you can just do what you want to do. There's no feeling of, oh, I need to think about what I need to do and how that would get a reaction. You just kind of do what you feel. So there is a kind of freedom to it. And as far as Nazrin Prod, I think we're going to continue with perhaps a video on my second favourite director, and I can spoil that, but something about a bullseye, if that's a clue. And then I think we'll probably go back to Bergman. We've had a wee break from Bergman, but we'll probably go back to Bergman on that as well.
Oh, very interesting. This is lovely. And I'm 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 looking forward to this very much. I must say also I love your. There are many things that you mentioned, like double takes. You also mentioned maybe comparison, comparative analyses on, say, different versions and different box
Yeah,
sets, and right. And so, which box set is your favorite among a
yeah. I
certain
recently
selection of
ranked the
choices?
Indicator box sets
Yeah, yeah. And
1 to
so this
18, which was interesting.
this is really a great thing because, as you say, this I mean there's so much to do, so little time, and so
Yeah,
we should try to take the time that we have and talk about what it is we want to talk about. And
yeah,
so, and if film is this vast ocean, let's you focus in on these filmmakers that
Yeah, because it actually surprised me what the #1 box set was. I didn't think it would be the one that it was, but it ended up being, which was quite surprising to me. So.
Which one was that, by the way, for anyone who's
It was
interested?
the Bud Bedicker and Randolph Scott westerns,
That's
because they were
Yeah.
incredible. They're all like 80 minutes or under, but they didn't need to be any longer, which is a gift. More filmmakers need to learn, how long does my film have to be, and not make it any longer. They're just wonderful. There's so much going on underneath the surface. We talked about Richard Lester, things under the surface. Those films are just amazing. Obviously, Sinbad, the Harryhausen stuff was near the top, but I was actually surprised that the Bedicker films, that set is just absolutely wonderful. It's sadly out of print, but there's standard releases now, so I would urge people to pick those up because they are just wonderful.
I agree. That's yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah. And oh my goodness, my dear friend, thank you so much for that great recommendation. And so once again, my dear friend, this is Solitary Ronin, and could you once again let us know where we can find you?
Yeah, the YouTube channel Solitary Ronin Films. The one with Nazarin Prod is Ronin Nazarin Talks, and you can browse the video playlists there.
And so this can be found on YouTube, these two
YouTube,
channels.
yes.
Okay, so what I will do is I will have all that information in the description box of this particular video.
Thank you.
So I want to urge everyone who has yet to experience these great channels to go to these channels, check out Solitary Ronin's fine work, and please subscribe to the channels and comment and engage and have conversations with this wonderful friend, our dear friend, Mr. Solitary Ronin. So thank you so much, my dear friend. Let's keep doing this. Let's do this again very soon, if that's okay.
Well, like I said, thank you very much. You're a constant inspiration for not only me, but lots of people in this community. And it is a great community. I have regular commenters and subscribers that, their knowledge and recommendations have burst my wallet on many occasions, and long may it continue.
Thank you very much, my dear friend. And please keep up the excellent work. And we will talk very soon.
Yes, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bye.